Welcome. We are in the middle of a new series here at Rooftop. Not new series anymore. We're in the middle of a medium-length series right now called The One Another's. And this series is all about what it means to be a church family in the fullest sense of the phrase. As we talked about, to be a Christian just doesn't mean to be saved from sin and death by Jesus. It does mean that. But it also means to be called into a new family, a new community. And that's what the church is. That's what our church should be, a community, a family. And the Bible has a lot to say about just how to do that. And in general, what the Bible says about how to do that is to blank one another. And that's why this is called the one another's. And that blank in Scripture is filled with all kinds of verbal commands. Love one another, honor one another, encourage one another, confess your sins to one another. And one of the other things the Bible has to say about this is to submit to one another. Now, it can be hard to submit to one another, though, as the band has so rebelliously demonstrated to us this morning. Sometimes you'd just rather not submit. Sometimes you've just had enough. Sometimes you just say, you're not going to take it anymore. There will be no more submission. There will be no more following. There will be only rock. While I appreciate the spirit, though, this is not how healthy church families work. No, nor is it how worship pastors keep their jobs. Healthy church communities are places of respect as we humbly submit to and serve the interests of one another, submitting one another in love. As Paul writes to the Ephesians, this is going to be kind of our theme verse of the morning, as he writes, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Unfortunately, this is not always our instinct. I mean, as sinners, we are rebels at heart. Sometimes we've just had enough, right? We've just had enough of what parents, pastors, doctors, teachers, government officials tell us to do. From its founding, our nation was a nation of rebels that rejected authority and threw tea into bays. The clip I was going to show you this morning, before, it's actually a news clip from Seattle and Portland. Maybe you know that following the death of George Floyd a couple years ago, some of America's more progressive cities set up so-called autonomous zones. So these autonomous zones were parts of these cities that decided they had just had enough of police brutality and economic injustice and civic leaders who seemed more interested in re-election than really making things better. They weren't going to take it anymore. So they created autonomous zones in which they were in charge. Now, reports on how life went in these autonomous zones was, let's say, mixed. In their own way, though, churches can be like that. Churches can be filled with people who have set up their own little autonomous zones. Christians don't always like being told what to do, even by pastors and leaders. Our pastors, our leaders, give us something to do, and we think, Our small group leader points out something the Bible says we should probably do as Christians, and we think, maybe. Lots of Christians like to sort of hang out on the fringes of any church they're going to at the time to make a quick exit in case the pastor tells them to do something they don't want to do. Now, to be sure, many people in church make it hard to submit to them. Pastors and priests and elders and leaders, they can occasionally be terrible leaders whose authority should just flat out be rejected. Nor am I saying that to submit to one another means blindly obeying one another. Churches should not be cults. Nor am I saying that Rooftop does this badly. I am not now scolding you for being rebellious. I will talk to the worship team later, though. What am I saying then? Well, I'm saying what God does in Ephesians, that Christians should submit to one another. It is an essential part of being a healthy church family. But what does that mean? What does it really mean to submit to one another? Well, in my research this week, I stumbled upon a sermon on this very topic by a Scottish preacher named Alistair Begg. And his outline was actually very good. The content was meh. So I'm actually going to use the outline, but insert my own material. We're going to talk about the matter of submitting to one another. We're going to talk about the means of submitting to one another. We're going to talk about the motive of submitting to one another. The matter, the means, and the motive. Starting with the matter. What does it really mean to submit to one another? What is the matter? For starters, what does it even mean to submit? Well, the English word submit comes from a very important Greek word that we're going to use a lot this morning. The Greek word is hupotasso. Everybody turn to your neighbor and say, hupotasso. Hupatasso, right. So hupatasso is sometimes translated to be subject to, and it comes from two Greek words, hupo and tasso. Hupo means under, and tasso means orders. So hupatasso means under orders. As you can tell, it's a military word used to describe how soldiers should behave under the command and authority of leaders who are in charge of them. The word means to respect the authority of those who are in charge of you. Do what they say, trust their leadership, be a good soldier. The interesting thing about Paul's command to submit to one another, though, it isn't actually the word hupatasso, it's the next word, aleilois. So aleilois means one another. That's the most common Greek word in our series, one another, aleilois. Now, how is it possible, though? Here's the question. How is it possible to submit to each other? The image I get is like of two people standing at a door, like, after you, no, after you, no, after you, no, after you. It kind of reminds me of how it is when Michelle and I are trying to decide where to go to dinner. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Where do you want to go? How are we supposed to submit to one another? Well, if it hasn't already upset you, the next part of my sermon might. You see, in order to understand what it means to submit to one another, as Paul has described it, we need to keep reading. Maybe you know that this verse in Ephesians occurs at the top end of a very important but controversial section in which Paul begins to talk to households about how to live with each other. He talks to husbands and wives, fathers and children, and masters and slaves. So let me show you what I mean. In verse 21, Paul writes, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he goes on. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives. And then, children, obey your parents in the Lord. And fathers, do not exasperate your children. And then, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect. And masters, treat your slaves the same way. Now, this is a very challenging passage for many reasons. There is a fierce and long-standing debate about this passage and what Paul's words mean. I mean, should slaves really submit to masters? Should slavery even exist? And yeah, Paul tells all people to submit to one another, but then he tells wives to submit to their husbands without specifically telling husbands to submit to their wives. He just tells husbands to love their wives. So aside from the problematic issue of slavery, there seems to be an imbalance here between husbands and wives and who should submit to whom. And there also seems to be an inconsistency. Paul has told everybody to submit to everybody else, but then he doesn't tell husbands to submit to wives, so are husbands to submit to wives or not, and masters to slaves or not. I don't want to get too complicated, although I know too late. But one of the big questions here is whether or not Paul's words here have timeless application. What I mean is he wrote these words in the first century when fathers and husbands and masters generally had greater authority in their families, in their households, and when certain forms of slavery persisted. So some people think those forms of family life were only temporary, we're culturally conditioned. That's just kind of how they did it back then. We don't need to do it like that anymore. Some people think, however, that while it is good that slavery has been made illegal, the marriage relationship, family arrangements are different. So just like husbands were in charge back then, some people think husbands should still be in charge as God has ordained. Maybe you know about this debate, maybe you don't know about this debate, and you're royally confused. That's fine. Perhaps disappointingly for you, I am not going to resolve that debate this morning, if I even could. I bring it up mostly because I think it can help us understand what it looks like to submit to one another. Remember that Paul's instruction here is to submit to one another, and that's the heading of the passage. That's the big idea up at top. Submit to one another. And then he speaks to opposite members in a Christian household. Wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters. Now we don't have to decide, at least not right now, for purposes of this sermon, we don't have to decide whether or not Paul thought his model of marriage with the husband as the head of the family should last forever in all cultures. That's a separate sermon. We don't need to decide that this morning. For our purposes this morning, we just need to acknowledge that this is how they did it back then. Husbands were in charge of families, fathers were in charge of children, and masters were in charge of slaves. People had different positions of leadership. That's true in any culture. That's true in any family. That's true in any nation. That's true in any church. Some people are in charge of others. To submit to one another means to recognize that and to be good soldiers about it. Basically, I describe the matter of submitting to one another this way. To submit to one another means to respect and obey the authority, leadership, and wisdom of the people around you. That's what it means to submit to one another. It means to respect and obey the authority, leadership, and wisdom of the people around you. You should certainly do that with the people who are in charge of you. I mean, I submit to my church elders because they're in charge of me. They're my bosses. The Bible tells me so. Have confidence in your leaders. Submit to their authority. But I submit to other people too. Anybody who has authority, leadership, and expertise, I don't have. You know, when the plumber comes over and tells me my toilet is broken and I need to get a new one, I don't say, wait a second. You're not the boss of me. I say, okay, that sounds good. When Heather Gain, our director of marketing and outreach here at Rooftop, tells me we probably need to change how we're advertising Rooftop on Google, I don't say, Heather, what do you know about church communications? No, I say, that sounds good. When my wife Michelle tells me I probably need to get my health problems looked at by a doctor, I don't say, you know what, I'm sick of this. I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm going to set up a little autonomous zone. I mean, what right do you have to tell me, Michelle, about my health concerns? Now, not that this has ever happened, but if it did, my wife might, at that point in the conversation, show me her nursing degree. She might then show me her master's degree. She might show me the badge that she uses to check into the hospital every day where she runs a department full of experts. She might show me the books on her shelf that she is studying to complete her doctorate. She might do all that, but trust me, my wife does not need to. That's what it means to submit to one another. It means to respect and obey the authority, leadership, and wisdom of the many, many people around us. I mean, there are many people who know more than we do on many, many things. There are people that God has given to us to help us live well. Leaders, pastors, spouses, government officials, teachers, mental health experts. Now, again, I'm not saying that we owe these people blind obedience. In a best case scenario, there is a learning and a growing and even an accountability process whereby two parties work together to understand the rules and recognize who's in a better position to exercise leadership in any given situation. And if someone is actually in charge of somebody else, either appointed by God or by human convention, that does not mean they have the right to exercise their authority with arrogance, impertinence, or violence, just the opposite. The burden on one party to submit to the other is matched by the burden on the other party to lead well. So there are caveats, but the essence of mutual submission, and that's what we're talking about here in this passage, mutual submission, me submitting to you, you submitting to me. And the essence of mutual submission in churches and families is that Christians should recognize that God puts different people in our lives to lead us well, and we should follow them. Amen. Sometimes, even when we don't want to. Now, let me acknowledge, before we move on, that I actually don't have much of a problem with submission. It's always come kind of easy for me. I've always been eager to please my parents, my teachers, my bosses growing up. I like having leaders. I mean, I will admit to you, in a moment of public candor, I will admit to you that during COVID, I was pretty willing to do what the government told me to do. The Bible says, submit to governing authorities. The Bible actually says that, submit to governing authorities. And I was like, okay. Sure, masks. Okay, I mean, what do I know about pandemics? Also, I like having church elders. I mean, in case you don't know, Rooftop is led by a team of godly elders. I'm one of them, but they supervise me, and I like it. The collective elders here at Rooftop, they are smarter, wiser, and more godly than me. I am blessed to submit to them. We took an elder retreat last weekend to talk about church vision, church stuff. And at the end of the weekend, I had a bunch of stuff to do. So we got back on Sunday afternoon. I came to church on Sunday night to do my job because they're my elders. Same thing with my wife. I mean, I recognize Michelle's leadership in my life. Now, sure, there are moments when I am in charge at home. There are. Give me a second. Home maintenance, finances, refilling the bird feeder, my job. Speaking of birds and the bees talks with our boys, not with our girls. Spiritual leadership, we've just both agreed. My job, make sure my family's growing in Jesus. But there are times when Michelle's in charge, and it's just stupid for me to think she's not. My point is, I'm a compliant personality. I actually am. Don't believe the hat. I'll do what you tell me to do. But maybe you're not that way. Maybe you're a rebel. Maybe you've set up a little autonomous zone in your life. Maybe you're not going to take it anymore. Maybe you suspect, however, that God's calling you to learn submission to leaders, wise friends, counselors who probably know what they're talking about. Maybe you're a little too in love with your own will. My question for you this morning, God's question for you this morning is, how will you learn submission? Well, this brings us to the means of submission. We've talked about the matter of submission at length. What of the means? In other words, how do we submit? Well, honestly, this is easy. I mean, it's not easy to submit. It's easy to know how we can submit. Let's go back to Ephesians. I want to show you something interesting from this passage, and frankly, something that's not altogether obvious in the scriptures, at least in our English versions. So you should know that formatting and periods and commas and section titles in our English Bibles, they can oftentimes distract from the actual meaning of the text. And I think that actually happens a little bit in this section. So what I mean is, Paul's command here in verse 21 is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So that's Paul's command here. Now, like I said, that's the introductory sentence for the next section in which Paul describes what life should look like in a first century household, at least in the first century, maybe in other centuries. But that sentence is also actually the concluding sentence of the previous section. So it's a transitional sentence that introduces the next section and concludes the previous section. And let me show you the previous section. It starts way up in verse 18. Paul writes, "Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery." So remember that as you're planning your big presidential day parties. Don't have one of those debauchery-filled presidential day parties. I know you're looking forward to it. But then Paul goes on. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. So don't be filled with wine. What should you be filled with? English. Okay. Spirit. And this isn't obvious in the text because of the paragraph breaks and the punctuation, but it's there. Paul tells us to be filled with the Spirit, and then he actually lists ways to practice and cultivate a Spirit-filled life. Here's what he says, and I've formatted it differently so that you can kind of understand what he's saying more accurately. He says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs, singing and making music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything, and submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ is the final example Paul offers for how we can live by the Spirit of God. So I know you don't know Greek, but if you did, you'd see it. There's no period after the first three. It's there. It's number 4. And my point is, for some of you, submission is hard. It's hard to do what other people tell you to do. How do you do it? It takes the Spirit of God. You cannot do it on your own. You need the power of God to respect the power of others. There is no other way. You need God's help. I remember years ago when I was in seminary, I was taking classes with a friend, and she had just gotten married recently, and she was having a really hard time in her new marriage. I mean, she wasn't particularly conservative or anything. She and her husband viewed themselves as equal partners in marriage, but she could also tell that marriage was challenging her independence, her will, and her trust in other people, particularly in her husband. She confessed to me to being critical of everything her husband did. He didn't do the dishes the way she would. He didn't talk to people the way she would. He didn't spend money the way she would. He didn't drive the way she would. He did everything differently. He did everything wrong. He wasn't demanding about it. It's just who he was, but it drove her crazy, and she could not help herself from criticizing him in her heart and in her words. Have I described that anybody here is familiar with? One night she told me they were driving to a function and having a little newlywed spat. He had taken a route to the party that she would not have taken. And along the way, he just kept hitting pothole after pothole after pothole. And she was telling him about it. Stop hitting the potholes. And he was getting defensive, and it blew up into an argument. And she sat there fuming in the passenger seat, thinking to herself, why did I marry this doofus? Why did I marry this man? I don't trust him, she thought. And she said that there in the passenger seat, she heard the voice of God in her heart. The voice said, you don't have to trust him. You have to trust me. She said her spirit just broke. And into that space rushed the Spirit of God, who gave her a sense of peace to know that she could live with and submit to this man, and that it was good for her soul. Now, I've lost track of her. I wonder how it's going, as I'm sure it's hard, but I've never forgotten that conversation. Having to submit to people in our lives challenges many of us at the deepest level. We're not going to take this. We're not going to take you hitting all the potholes. We're going to take your silly 80s video clips. We're not going to take you telling us what to do. And yes, there are limits. I mean, if you are, hear me very clearly, if you are in an abusive relationship, you need to get out. But in many circumstances, we need to trust God as we learn to subject our will to His. And we need His Spirit, His voice to give us His strength to do that. But in order to receive His Spirit, we got to ask for it. We got to depend on it. We got to know we need it. Sometimes submitting to other people is only possible by the power of God inside of us. So we've talked about the matter of submission. We've talked about the means of submission. Finally, let's talk about the motive. The motive of submitting to one another. What should be our motive? Why should we do this? Why should we live like this? Well, there are lots of reasons to submit. It's good for our souls. Catholics actually practice submission as a spiritual discipline. A lot of Catholics actually have a spiritual director who, frankly, tells them what to do. And they have promised themselves they will do it. It's good for our communities and for relationships, assuming they are well led. But why does the Bible say we should submit? Well, as Paul has said, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Why should we submit? Out of reverence for Jesus. Now, I've done a lot of Greek work here this morning, but let me show you one more Greek word. The Greek word for reverence here is the word phobos. From the word phobia, can also be translated, yes, and it can be translated, revere or respect. But what's a more literal translation of the word phobia? Fear. Submit to one another out of fear of Christ. Fearing Jesus is not together all a bad thing. It means we understand his power, his authority. God the Father has given us all authority in heaven and on earth. Power to create, power to destroy, power over us and everything that lives, walks, and breathes. We show God we understand the power and authority of Jesus by submitting to God-given authorities and leaders in our own lives. Maybe you know that in Ephesians, each of Paul's commands is motivated by a higher relationship to God. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Fathers, bring up your children in the Lord. Slaves, obey your masters as you would obey Christ. Masters, treat your slaves knowing that your master is in heaven. God is watching. Our master is watching how we respect, obey, and submit to each other. The world is watching too. We show the world the power and the authority of Jesus by respecting and obeying the power and the authority of the people in our lives. I remember a story that Dietrich Bonhoeffer once told in a sermon, and I'll leave you with this before we close with communion. A story about Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great was a great Greek general in the 4th century BC who conquered the Western world. And once, when Alexander was warring his way through the Achaemenid Empire, through conquest and violence, he came upon a fortress high on a cliff known as the Sogdian Rock. Within this cliff fortress, King Oxyartes of Bactria, you know King Oxyartes of Bactria? You've heard about King Oxyartes? Well, King Oxyartes of Bactria was holed up in the Sogdian Rock with his family, soldiers, and people. They had made their way to the fortress when they heard that Alexander was on the move. And when Alexander arrived at the cliff fortress, he demanded that King Oxyartes of Bactria surrender his fortress and his people. The soldiers shouted down from the walls, "Never! You would have to have wings to get up here." King Oxyartes believed the fortress to be impregnable and well supplied. Immediately, though, Alexander began sending men up the face of the cliff with tent pegs as holds. The cliff was steep, hard to climb, but he sent them one by one. Some made it up, but 30 of them fell to their deaths. And he sent some more. At this site, the King Oxyartes of Bactria, opened the gates. King surrendered the fortress. Even though most of Alexander's army remained on the ground and his soldiers were actually falling to their deaths, and even though the king was actually safe behind the walls and the soldiers hanging up on the cliff by tent pegs were not much of a threat, the king knew he stood no chance against an army so devoted to its king that they would climb to their death. When we live for and submit to one another in humility and obedience, the world sees the power and authority of our King. They think, Jesus is coming. He's got an army that's willing to die. We better open the gates. This is hard for us, though. Like I said, we're not always good soldiers. God asks us, though, to do hard things. You want me to do what? You want me to climb the cliff? But there's a pile of bodies, dead bodies at the bottom of the cliff. Why would we do that? We're not good submitters. But to be a Christian means to give up our will for God's, even if we don't understand it, even if we don't like it, sometimes even to death. Because even if we can't trust our leaders or spouses, or pastors, we can trust God who gave them to us. This is the very essence of Christianity. Probably you know that Jesus himself lived a life of submission. If anybody had power and authority to stand up to God to say he wasn't going to take it anymore, it was God's own son. But Jesus came to earth and devoted himself to the will of the Father. Even to the point of death, Jesus climbed the cliff. As Paul writes to the Philippians, Christ humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cliff. It wasn't easy for him, didn't want to do it, but he did as he prayed in the garden. Not my will, Father, yours be done. That's what it means to submit to one another. It means to sacrifice our will to the people in our lives that God has given to lead and help us, to show the world the power of Jesus. And this is what we remember in communion.